Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. I hope that today's meeting will be quite enlightening and you will enjoy the day. I'll start with introducing our honorable guests. I think Stephen doesn't need to be much presented in Georgia, and yesterday we talked a lot about him and he spoke at this university. But still, a couple of words about him. He started his researches on the Democratic Republic of Georgia much before than any Georgian in 1970s when Georgian scholars were more or less forbidden to touch the topic, and since then he has been visiting this country every year or several times a year, and he has published many articles and his excellent book on Georgian social democracy, socialism in Georgian colors. Recently, or several years ago, he published another book, his second volume on contemporary independence of Georgia, and he's finishing now his monograph on the First Republic of Georgia. So everyone knows that he's the best specialist worldwide on the First Republic. But we have a man who started his research on Caucasian republics and first independence even much before, when Stephen was a little child probably, yeah? And as once Professor Kovanesian commented 5 years ago when we first met, I started research on the first republics when even your grandparents were children. So it's true, he started doing it in 1950s, and I don't need written notes to tell you about his biography. So he has written massive 5 volumes on Armenia's first independence. So his PhD was on the road to independence, and from 1971 to 1996 he published 4 volumes on the Republic of Armenia, and as I once was told in Oxford, he has written 80 pages per every day of Armenian independence. He has visited archives on various continents in various countries. So I had the privilege to use his books for my PhD thesis and for my monograph as a guideline. So I'm really very honored to have these 2 men here. And apart from that, Richard probably will tell us his private, personal stories, that his family comes from the genocide survivors, and with this regard, he additionally has much more research projects. So please, our honorable professors, give us opening statements, 10 minutes per each. Thank you.
Good evening. It's quite exciting for me to be here on this occasion where we celebrate the 100th anniversary of the 3 republics of the South Caucasus, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia at the same time. 3 fellow peoples living in the same region, having a lot of similarities, but also some great difficulties with one another, and we keep on hoping that the South Caucasus will find a means of peace and security for the sake of its people and future generations. As Becca said, I've spent most of my life studying the history of the First Armenian Republic, and I probably thought, just to give you a little background, I really shouldn't be the person to have written that, because my background was such that I didn't speak Armenian. I didn't know Armenian as a child. My parents had come as refugees after terrible events in the Ottoman Empire. And those of us who were born in America as the first generation of children of the survivors were not comfortable being Armenians. I as a child, had identity issues. I wanted to be accepted by American society, to be Anglo, to be a part of what was expected. And American society was not very tolerant. It was very racist. It insisted that all the immigrants become Anglo as quickly as possible, forget the old world, forget the way of life, etc. And it was only in later years, even though I was always interested in history, and only in later years, that I began to develop an interest in the Republic, partly because even though I had identity crises, I still was aware that I was an Armenian, and like probably anyone of minority groups, when you look at a book, the first thing you do, you go to the index to see if the name Georgia is there or the name Armenia is there, and frequently it was not there. I had realized and understood that for a brief time there had been an independent Armenian state. And when I went to the United Nations for the first time in the early 1950s, I looked up at all the flags, and there was no Armenian flag. And again, this was something, that causes a degree of pain and wonder. And so increasingly I became interested in this republic. And I'm not so sure that it's true in the Georgian case, because probably the Georgians did not have such a large diaspora as the Armenians had. The Armenian diaspora, more Armenians have always lived outside of Armenia than have lived inside of Armenia. And our community was very split. I remember in the 1930s, when I was just a youngster growing up, and in the 1940s, the enormous hostility within the community and blaming one another for Armenian failures. And in particular, the greatest conflict within this large diasporan community related to the first Armenian Republic of 1918, 1920, and its failure, and whom should we blame for its failure? And secondly, what is our attitude toward Soviet Armenia? And a part of the community that sort of worshipped the Armenian flag, which was three colors, red, blue, and orange stripes, that part of the community was vehemently anti-Soviet and regarded Armenia as being a captive nation, in being occupied. The other half of the community thought that under the circumstances, it was the best thing that was possible, because after all, Armenia was a small country, landlocked, surrounded by not very friendly people. They had been through destruction of Armenians in the Turkish Empire. There was a threat in 1918 in the Turkish invasions of both Georgia and Armenia that the Armenian people would disappear. And so at least there was the security of Soviet protection and the development of the Armenian people under Soviet rule. So very, very split. And those who liked the Armenian flag, the three colors, had this dream that Armenia was a wonderful, democratic, prosperous country. And those who were opposed, the opposite, a land of death, destruction, oppression, and neither side was true and accurate. So I decided that when I finally decided I wanted to do Armenian history, because in all of America, in the time that I was a student, a graduate student even, there were no courses in Armenian in America. So in a sense, my generation had to create those courses. And because I didn't know Armenian, I went to Beirut, Lebanon, where there was a very large Armenian community that spoke Armenian. We American Armenians did not speak Armenian. And so I spent a year there and learned the Armenian language well enough to start doing research, and went back to the University of California, did my MA, and then at UCLA in Los Angeles completed my doctoral degree on the Armenian Republic. I thought I could write the whole history of 2 years in one volume. After all, it wasn't that long, but what I found out in the end that there's so much information, so much archival material in 10 different repositories in the United States, from the Library of Congress to the Massachusetts Historical Association. In Great Britain, the British, whether you like these imperialists or not, were the wonderful, wonderful record keepers and have collected so much material on the Caucasus. Can you believe that in the British archives, I'm sitting and I'm finding an Armenian newspaper published in Tiflis, and all runs of Armenian papers, because they had collected everything and sent them to London. I mean, who would ever think that would be of any interest to anyone at some time, and yet that was being done. And so the archival holdings on the Republic are just extensive, and I found out that trying to write a history of the Armenian Republic with all its complications was not possible in one volume, and I ended up spending 30 years up until 1996, when I published the third and fourth volume of that. And you know, it all started right here on what was known as Golovinsky Prospect, Rustaveli Prospect, in the Aramyan's mansion on Rustaveli, where the representatives of the Armenians of the Russian Empire had created, after the first revolution in 1917, had a major conference here in Tiflis and elected a representative council known as the Armenian National Council that sat in the Aramyan's mansion. And in 1918, it was that council, in the midst of desperate, desperate times, of having lost all the half of Armenia, historic Armenia, in the Turkish Empire, then faced the possibility of the destruction of the Armenians of the Caucasus, because the Turkish armies had already advanced over Kars and Ardahan. They were moving all the way into the province of Yerevan and Mount Ararat. They occupied Alexandropol, today known as Gumri, and before known as Leninakan, the second largest city of Yerevan province. And they were making their way all the way to Yerevan itself. And it seemed that the end of the Armenians were there. It was then, as you well know, that the Georgian leaders, with Jordania, with Gegichkori, with Ramishvili, and Chechidze and others, made the decision that they had to protect their own interests and their own people by withdrawing from the attempt to create a Caucasian federation, an attempt to combine Armenians, Georgians, and Muslims into a common front in the Caucasus. But the differences were so great among them, and their perceptions of one another were so difficult, that in the end, the federation that lasted only 1 month failed. And as you know better than I, the Georgian Menshevik leaders in particular decided that for the sake of their own people, they had to withdraw. And having gained assurances from German representatives that German troops were not far away and that they would be in Georgia in a very short time, as you know, the Georgian National council and members of the government, of the Transcaucasian government, declared in a very eloquent style, I might say. I mean, I really admire Irakli Tsereteli and his orations, beautiful orations, in which he explained why the Georgians had to abandon the Armenians, who were being left to the mercy of the Turks. He said, as I said, in a very, very poetic way. And as you know, then on May 26th, both the Transcaucasian Federation was dissolved and the Georgian Republic was proclaimed. And that put the Armenians into a very difficult situation because now they're alone. The Muslim population leaders of the Caucasus will very soon declare the independence of a new state that had not existed before, known as Azerbaijan, the Republic of Azerbaijan, even though its natural capital, Baku, was under the control of the Baku Soviet and not under their own control, but nonetheless they declared independence, and it left the Armenians sitting here in the Aramyan's mansion not knowing what to do. They wanted to keep the link with Russia as a means of protection against the Turkish invasion, to say that at least, you know, we're a part of the Russian Empire, you can't go, you're violating the Russian territories by the Turkish to the Turks. In any case, in a very, very difficult decision, they decided finally there was no other choice than to declare the independence of Armenia. And they dated the declaration on May 28th, that is yesterday, the 100th anniversary. And that started the 100th, and the 2.5 years. And one point I want to make probably about the Georgians and Armenians is that both of them were reluctant to go on the road to independence. And it's not because they didn't want independence. After all, the Bagratid dynasty had been here until the 19th century. There was a great deal of resistance and resentment toward Russian imperial rule in Georgia, but it was the timing that seemed impossible, the circumstances that seemed impossible for that to happen. And in the Armenian case as well, these are people who are striving for civil rights, equality, in the Ottoman Empire, and that ended up in genocide, and are seeking reforms in the Russian Empire, but are not seeking, do not find it proper timing and logical to look for independence at that moment. And so in both cases, in a sense, they were thrust toward independence against their will. And then they had to make the best out of the circumstances. By comparison, Georgia had a much better hope for a viable independent state than Armenia. What Armenia had to begin with was just about 1/3 of what is there today, with Yerevan and a part of an Echmiadzin, the religious center, with Turkish troops and occupation all around them, no exit to the sea, no means of communication. And so you can understand why the Armenian government that was formed here in Tbilisi, by the Armenian National Council, why it didn't go immediately to Yerevan, which was the provisional capital. I say provisional capital because it's not what the Armenians thought would be their capital. If they were going to have a capital, it would be in the Turkish Empire, in Van, Erzurum, or somewhere else. And here it is, suddenly history has played tricks on them and they come to Yerevan. Well, and so they didn't leave Tiflis until July of 1918. That is, they declare independence in May, but they stay here because it's very difficult to leave this wonderful city. And they make excuses. I mean, the Armenians considered Tiflis as their unofficial capital in the Russian Empire. They had more Armenians living in this city, more institutions, more cultural organizations, more than anywhere else in the Russian Empire. Just as the Armenians of the Ottoman Empire, ironically, Constantinople was their unofficial capital, with all the center of their church, their cultural, political, economic organizations, and the homeland had become very backward there. Well, I've taken more than 10 minutes, I think, and I just want to say that they made heroic efforts. They made heroic efforts. I know all the shortcomings that were made of these leaders, both of the Menshevik leadership of Georgia, the Armenian Dashtkhachun and its supporters, the Musavat party in Azerbaijan. But these are people who are raised in a particular generation, a unique generation that had been exposed to European thought, internationalism, socialist thought, and at the same time having to take this socialist thought and internationalism and bring it home and to fashion it into the local national interest. And so the challenge of combining nationalism and socialism stood, particularly in Armenia and Georgia, stood throughout. And they made mistakes. I don't think that any of those mistakes that they made affected the outcome of what happened, that is the return of Russian Soviet rule to the Caucasus. I think that objectively the circumstances, world circumstances that were there made it inevitable, because unless there was going to be external support, real support, and all the pledges of that support had been made, by the way, in the time of the Armenian destruction in the Ottoman Empire, every kind of beautiful declaration had been made about the restoration of the Armenian people, rehabilitation of the Armenian people, the need for a separate national home, and so forth, and those pledges were not honored. There were reasons for that I'll not go into. And so I would say that these three republics made a heroic effort. They made a heroic effort, but it was not sufficient to ensure continued national existence. And I cannot think of what policies they might have taken that would have altered that. I mean, we know that Georgia received the recognition of Soviet Russia within certain boundaries and certain pledges and so forth, but it was not honored. It was violated. Just as in Armenia in December of 1920, the last Armenian government, independent government, made an agreement with the Soviets in giving up rule because the Turkish armies were again at their doors. And they signed it, a very, very official declaration of Soviet Russia guaranteeing the boundaries of Armenia, etc. But within a week, they had repudiated that agreement, and it was for nothing. And so if these states were not going to get the requisite external support, then I suppose it was inevitable that they should go back into the Russian sphere. And the lesson, I suppose, is, if possible, we can't rely very much on others. One needs to depend on their own resources as much as possible. And the challenge for small people, whether they're Georgians, Armenians, or others, is, it may sound a bit humiliating, but the challenge is to persuade the world powers that your existence and your development is not only in your interest, but is in their interest, and that it's worthy of them to invest in your future for the betterment of their future. And I'm not going into any details on the First Armenian Republic, except that, say again, when these, Armenia, again, in contrast probably with Georgia, because Georgia had a strong infrastructure here with a namestnik, with the viceroy of the Caucasus, with the administration, etc. So you had a very stable infrastructure here, and there was no destruction here. In contrast to Armenia, where when that government transferred from Tiflis to Yerevan in July of 1918, it found only zero, nothing. No infrastructure, no government. All there were a few chinovniks, bureaucrats around, but no national government whatsoever. Economy zero, and 300,000 refugees from the Turkish Empire. This is what they started with. And in 2.5 years, again, qualifying, because it was never a complete place. But they had started a state university, and they had opened a conservatory. They had brought in dramatic groups. They had opened up from a very few schools to more than 800 schools. And so if these states had continued as independent states, one could say that they would have possibly really a bright future. And the final thing is, I should say, it's interesting that in Armenia, I just came from Armenia and a conference there, it's pretty well accepted that Armenians call the current republic the Third Republic of Armenia. And they give place to 70 years of Soviet rule as being the Second Republic. On the grounds that, first of all, they delivered legally a document, they signed a document transferring power from the old government to the new government, and that you cannot ignore 70 years of development of the infrastructure, literacy, cultural, educational, scientific, academic interest. Now that may not make everyone happy, but I just want to explain to you sort of a different mentality in Armenia relating to Soviet years, probably predicated on the continuing landlocked condition of the country, continuous fear of external intervention in the life of the people. And so whether it's a Second Republic or the Third Republic, I think we can all be proud of the fact that we had dedicated people, men of international standing. As you know, the Mensheviks had important international standing that then tried to bring their talents to their own people and a future independent state. Thank you.
I want to thank Becca, I want to thank the university for arranging this talk, and I'm so happy to be here with Richard again. Richard and I did some early conferences in the United States on the Caucasian republics 30 years ago now, most of it in Los Angeles at UCLA because it had so many resources, and I always remember being perhaps the only person speaking about Georgia at that time, with very few Georgians in the audience. The governor at that time happened to be, governor of California happened to be Armenian, Duke Medjian. The chief of police from Los Angeles was present. It was a wonderful celebration of the Caucasian republics, but it was hard because at that time so few people knew about those republics, and in particular about the First Republic in Georgia. So it's been a long and hard path, I think, to come to a place where now the First Republic on its 100th anniversary is getting some recognition. And I'm very glad to see young historians like Becca and Irakli Ramadze and Irakli Kradagiani, who are really doing some excellent work now in rediscovering the First Republic and rediscovering it in all its complexity, because the problem in many cases regarding the history of the First Republic, and I talked about this yesterday, was that after its collapse in 1921, it, of course, was condemned as a bourgeois republic and disappeared from historical sight and ended up in the Spetsfund of libraries and archives in Georgia, and Georgian citizens had absolutely no idea about this most crucial part of their modern history. The unfortunate thing was when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a very brief window. I remember it when I was coming here in the early 1990s, when people were very excited to think and talk about the First Republic and its achievements and its uniqueness in terms of its goals at that time, because it was really an extraordinary experiment in many ways at that period in 1918-21. But very soon that window closed, because Georgia now was, the First Republic now was seen as a regime that was too left-wing and was condemned intellectually, because in the 1990s, of course, in Georgia and in other post-Soviet republics, there was this massive switch to the idea of the dominance of the market, of the neoliberal philosophy, and that these were the only things that could work and achieve prosperity. I disagree with that. And of course, in that context, Georgia again lost its interest. And it surprises me even today when I talk to Georgian citizens how little they know about the First Republic, given that it's not only its national significance, its historical significance, but also, of course, its global significance, its world significance. It was a very big event in 1918 when it declared its independence. So I'm very glad to be here and to see that people are again looking to remember a history that's been forgotten. And by doing so, perhaps discovering that, and this is something maybe we could talk about in the conversation, about the parallels that I've seen and I think about between the First Republic and the difficulties it faced and the solutions it tried to find in terms of building a nation or re-establishing a nation and rebuilding or building a state, a modern secular state for the first time. The parallels with that period and what we see today in Georgia, and particularly in the 1990s and early 2000s, the parallels are quite extraordinary in terms of the patterns and the tasks that both these republics faced. In a sense, I guess I'm even less qualified than Richard. Richard mentioned the fact that he didn't know Armenian. Well, I didn't know any Georgian when I first got interested in the Republic. I had absolutely no connection with Georgia. I was interested, however, in social democracy, and I was interested in national minorities. I was studying Soviet politics at the time in London, and I remember talking to my advisor, Peter Redaway, who was working on human rights and distant issues in the Soviet Union, and I said to him, I'm curious about Georgia because, there's nothing written about this early period, the First Republic. And he said, look, if you want a job, he said, don't study national minorities, study arms control. Then maybe you'll have a future. Little did he know, of course, that Gorbachev was about to arrive and make national minorities and nationalism the hot topic, and I got a job as a result. My life has been interwoven with Georgian politics, Georgian history, Georgian colleagues, friends, and it started in London with Vepri Strausani, actually, with Marjorie Wardrop's translation, which I came across completely by accident, read it, and decided that this was what I wanted to do. I wanted to find out more about this country, and it led me, in the end, to David Lang, who was my supervisor, my professor at that time, and then to an extraordinary man who was a resident in London. His name was Kaki Ramishvili, who was the son of Noy Ramishvili. And I think at that time in London there were only 2 Georgian emigres, in contrast to Paris. The other was called Bestuvashvili. I can't remember his first name. And I got very interested in the First Republic through Kaki, and then he took me to Lierville in France, where I met with some, believe it or not, some old social democrats who I was able to interview, some old socialist federalists as well. Now I'm talking to you, I can't remember their names, but I will be able to afterwards, I'm sure. And then came to Georgia in 1978 and tried to start my work on the First Republic. It was very difficult then because, of course, it was the Soviet Union, and nobody let me into the archives. I was not quite an enemy of the people, but I was a very suspicious person, snooping around newspapers that described the period of dealt with the period of the First Republic. So about the First Republic itself, I mean, one of the things that what I'm doing now is I'm writing a book. I've written about 8 chapters of 12 on the First Republic. And it's been a very interesting experience working deep in the archives, because you begin to realize that the devil is in the details. So when I first started writing about the First Republic, I was very much an idealist and gave the Georgian Republic the benefit of the doubt. I still do in many cases, but when you read the archives and you look at the letters and the policies, the letters between the Social Democrats themselves in terms of their private discussions, you realize that building a nation and building a state was an extraordinarily difficult process where very difficult decisions had to be made. Georgians, when they went with the Georgian Social Democrats, when they first started off, of course, were Marxists. But one of the things I think we ought to realize is that Marxism, not that I'm a Marxist anymore, but that Marxism is an extraordinarily complex philosophy, and it's interpreted in many different ways. And the Georgian Social Democrats, I call them Social Democrats because I believe that's what eventually they became, looked at Marxism in a very specific way. I mean, I always tell my students when we talk about socialism, I think the thing worth remembering is there's no such thing really as a universal form of socialism. Every socialism, as I said in my first book about it, is in particular colors. It has its own roots, its own indigenous path. And the Georgian Social Democrats certainly carved out a very specific philosophy that was different dramatically, of course, from Russian Bolshevism, but even different in many ways from Russian Menshevism. So, for me, when I think about Georgian social democracy, I think about its indigenous roots, and I would trace those to the Tegdali Ulubi. I think there was significant influence from the Georgian intelligentsia of the 1860s and 70s, despite the fact that Noy Jordania took a strong stand against Ilia Chavchavadze and nationalism. I think underneath the rhetoric, there was this constant movement within the Social Democratic Party to develop a national path. And you can see it in Noy Jordania's early writings, and you can certainly see it after he comes to power in 1918, when he realizes, as do many of the Social Democrats at that time, that this, once the Social Democrats came to power, this was no longer about defending a particular class, a proletarian class. This was no longer a proletarian revolution. It was a socialist revolution, but it was a socialist revolution interpreted in national form. And if you look at the policies that the Social Democrats pursued between 1821, you can see that their priority, and of course there were a lot of resistance to these priorities, was to nationalize the state, to make it a Georgian state, rather than a class-based international regime. The other part of it to remember is their dedication to European ideas. The Social Democrats were heavily influenced by German social democracy, Austrian social democracy, by French social democracy. If you go back to the ideas of people like Jean Jaurès in France, Frederick Lassalle, Kalkowski, Georg von Volmar, and others, there was this tremendous debates going on in Europe at this time, of which the Georgian organization was part. They were central to some of these debates. And, some of the most important of the questions was, what was the relationship, and Rich has already mentioned this, what was the relationship between nationalism and socialism, for example? And the Georgians took a really rather distinct view of that, very different from the Russian Mensheviks. What was the difference between revolution and reform? How much reform could be allowed? Some of the European socialists, like Edward Bernstein, wrote books called Evolutionary Socialism, suggesting a complete revision of Marxism, the idea being that you really didn't need a violent revolution and that you could create a social democratic regime through parliamentary means. That was an idea, by the way, that goes back to Marx and Engels, too. When I look at some of those debates going on in Europe, which, as I said, heavily influenced Georgian social democracy, you can see that the ideas of Volmar, for example, who was a Bavarian social democrat who talked very, very much about the importance of the peasants and how they were part of an oppressed group who should also be part of the nation. In other words, not a party that just represents one class, it represents all social groups. And that's how it's going to succeed. And you can see Jordania and others picking up these ideas. The idea, too, that you can move into socialism in an evolutionary fashion. This, again, was something that Georgian Social Democrats adopted after they came to power in 1918. Very quickly, Jordania said, okay, if we may still have socialist goals, but we're not going to have a socialist revolution. We're going to create a parliamentary state. And that's what they tried to do. They had great difficulty doing that because they were surrounded by potential threats, and of course they had internal threats as well. So that security, the issue of security, of national security, as indeed in the 1990s and 2000s, always intervened, always interfered with this process of democracy building. And it was a big problem for the Social Democrats. Sometimes they had to make very serious compromises. But it reflected, I think, a very strong strain of pragmatism among Georgian Social Democrats. So, for example, and this was mentioned yesterday, very quickly when they came to power, they reintroduced the death penalty, which was completely against their philosophy. They realized, too, that they couldn't just nationalize the land like the Bolsheviks did. They had to privatize it if they wanted to get some productivity out of it. And this is, in fact, what the peasants wanted. They wanted their own land. So they sold the land to the peasants. They got some revenue out of it. But again, this was a clear revision of Marxist ideas about how you progress towards a socialist state. I don't think in the end they abandoned socialism, but it became a long-term goal. And they were actually, what they were doing was creating what they called a minimum program, which was really, in a way, was not quite a liberal democracy. The Georgian leaders tried to distinguish themselves from a bourgeois republic in some ways by creating institutions and networks of self-government, so that the population had significant influence. I mean, not that it did, but at least that was the theory. So they created local self-governing bodies called the Erba, for example, and they created an institution so that judges would be elected. They created a jury system, which of course again was a reflection of accountability to the population. So there were all sorts of ways in which they were trying to democratize the state, but they again, as I said, they found constant conflicts with the conditions in which they existed. One more thing, they had no money, right? There was nothing in the treasury. So again, you're trying to create this system out of nothing, in a way. I mean, they had no resources. And, it's very hard to build a state and to create institutions if you don't have the resources to do it. They could have had resources if there had not been a war, if there had not been a blockade of Georgia, because there was plenty of manganese hanging around and there were plenty of foreign investors interested in the manganese. They just couldn't get it out in these conditions. So it led to hyperinflation. They just printed money because they didn't have anything really to use to build the state. And we're unable, and this perhaps was one of the greatest problems, we're unable to stabilize the monetary system in Georgia. So I better stop there. I see some people yawning and getting tired. I'm sure you've got some questions. So let me stop there, and please, your questions will be very welcome.
Thank you very much for your fine polished speeches. Now I suggest that we take turns. I'll be asking a questions, then I'll ask audience to ask the questions, then again me, and just to keep some consistency. So the first question, I will use opportunity being here, and I'll ask the first question. So. For some people in Georgia, for new generation, and not only in Georgia, First Republic is something romantic, or for others it's like a bunch of mistakes and failures. But we do really know that these people did their utmost in both countries, in case of both countries. And mostly what they were doing, they were dealing with the immediate challenges and problems. They were fighting for survival. But had they lived longer, what were the countries they were building? So what would be the state building? So, for example, in case of Georgia, you mentioned the socialism and attainable socialism through parliamentary republic. But what would be the role of ethnic minorities in that republic? What would be the human rights? We can say that these aspirations were demonstrated in the constitution, but there was no consistency or compliance always between constitution and reality. So what were the end goals of Georgian social democrats and Armenian Dashnaks?
Thank you, Becca, for that question, and I hope there will be many more questions for Richard as well. I know we're sitting in an auditorium. Oh, it's for both of us. Yeah. Okay, good. So, what can you do in 3 years, and what can you do without any financial resources? Not much. But what they did achieve was quite extraordinary at the same time. When you think, it's not so much about the Constitution, because the Constitution, as we know, was not actually passed until February 1921 and during the Soviet invasion. It's hard to say. What you can say is you can detect some of the direction that they were going in the terms of, for example, creating a multi-party democracy, right? I mean, not a democracy that was always clean and without corruption or even manipulation of votes. Of course, these things went on. They were establishing these new institutions for the first time without any experience. But they created first a parliament or a national council, which became a parliament, and then they created the Constituent Assembly. It's clear from that process, and I think here it's worth mentioning the role of leadership. I think the leadership of Noy Jordania in particular, but also his comrades in arms like Gaki Chrenkeli, Grigol Gegachkori and others, was absolutely crucial in creating this sort of pro-European model. Because that's, what they had experienced in exile, and during the debates they were influenced by these ideas, and this is what they were striving for. What also helped was the fact that the Bolsheviks were providing an antithesis. That's not what they wanted, right? So, both those things working together helped them create this sort of this middle road, if you like, which was a sort of progressive social democracy, multi-party democracy, free speech, although not always. Sometimes newspapers were closed down that were considered too provocative. They gave a vote to all citizens above the age of 20. They opened up their doors to all national groups in Georgia that had been living there before 1914. That's not to say they didn't discriminate against national minorities. They did. And Richard might want to talk about the Armenian case. But they based the system of the state on this idea of full citizenship for everyone despite their ethnic identity and so on. And that was very positive at the time. And I'll just say one more thing, because I could go on and on about this, but one more thing is, I think when you're looking at the difficulties that they faced, Georgia was not unique in this respect during this period. If you look at the new states that were being created in Eastern Europe at this time, in Czechoslovakia, for example, which also was trying to establish a form of social democracy, or in Bulgaria and Romania and other of these new states, they all were going through the same things that Georgia were in terms of struggling with a financial situation in which they had no productive resources, in which they'd just gone through this war. Many of their people had been killed during the war. The economy had been devastated. What did they do as a result? Well, after a while, they realized the only thing they could do was to intervene. The state intervened. It didn't mean it necessarily monopolized, but the state could not survive without some degree of intervention by the state in terms of supporting production, factories, this sort of thing. And they were all looking for ways to control inflation and stabilize the economy through international loans and international investors. And by 1925, 1926, you saw these countries beginning to stabilize economically. Georgia, of course, never got to 1925, 26. I think that, in some sense, if Georgia had a longer period to develop relations with other Western powers, there was a negotiation, for example, with Great Britain for a loan in late 1920-21, and they almost received it, which would have been extremely helpful in stabilizing the currency. I think these things would have come. But in 3 years, and of course, with a particularly aggressive neighbor to the north and a particularly aggressive neighbor to the south, namely the Ottomans, this was an extraordinary, difficult thing to achieve for Georgia.
I'll try to be very brief and just say that no matter how the Caucasus was divided, there were going to be minority problems. There was a great deal of resentment toward Russian imperial rule. On the other hand, when the entire Caucasus was a part of the Russian Empire, it didn't really make that much difference if you were a Muslim in Tiflis or an Armenian in Baku. You were all a part of the same system, and you were quite comfortable where you were. And one of the negative and sad parts of national independence was that people who were in many ways your neighbor and equal became the other almost overnight. Became the other. Talking about the Armenians, you well know that there was a very large Armenian population in Tiflis province. The city of Tiflis itself had become, as I've mentioned, a major bourgeois, national, cultural, economic center for the Armenians. I don't remember exactly, but probably the last 7 of the 8 mayors of Tiflis had been Armenian, because the voting was based on property qualifications, and that gave them bourgeoisie an extraordinary advantage. And so it was not easy for that minority that felt so good about itself being in Tiflis, which was its home, then finding out almost overnight, well, hey, we're now different. We're not a part of the dominant group or the titular group. We're something else. And so there was this crisis, and it happened even worse. I mean, Georgia was lucky because virtually you had very, very few Georgians living outside the borders of the Republic of Georgia. In contrast with the Muslims who were everywhere, in contrast with the Armenians who were everywhere, and so they had much larger minority issues, and some of those became bloody. In the case of Georgia, yes, there was discrimination, but it was done in the name of social reform. The social reforms might affect 90% the Armenians who are in power, but you don't mention Armenians as social reform. And so there's a different way of approaching this. But I think it's sort of sad that there was an unraveling. I'm an internationalist in principle, and I think that minorities really enrich our existence and culture, but unfortunately that was not our experience. For 100 years, the 3 republics become increasingly mono-ethnic and mono-religious, maybe from the point of view of national, whatever it may be fine. But in any case, there is a problem. I don't think it was ever solved. And as we saw in the 1990s, after 70 years of Soviet rule of saying miru druzhba, the whole place blew up. And hundreds of thousands of people were displaced all over again.
Thank you very much. Sergey, please.
Sergey Kabanadze, Member of Parliament. So if you look at the 1917, beginning of 1918, what were the reasons, and what was the debate internally that concerns also the Georgian case and also the Armenian case about the declaration of independence? So who was in favor, who was against? What was the discussion around the topic? So that's first part of the question. The second part is, if you look at the foreign actors, because sometimes there is an idea that circulates that it was only because of the German pressure or of the Turkish pressure that the independence actually happened. So can you look at the different actors and say who was in favor, who was not in favor, and to what extent that contributed to the declaration of independence? And a separate question, sorry to hijack, but what was the position of the ethnic minorities in Georgia regarding the independence? And that's not only about the Abkhaz and Ossetians, but also the other minorities who were here, who signed the declaration, or if there was anybody who did not. So what was their position on this? Thank you.
Okay, this is something I mentioned yesterday, Sergey, that, actually every party, including the National Democrats, the Socialist Federalists and others, were not even thinking about independence, certainly not expressing it publicly before 1917. When the revolution came, of course, then there were internal party discussions, and towards November 1917, already public discussions. Now, Lasha's here, he's dealt with the Georgian National Committee. That had already started. This was a group of emigres in Germany that had already started thinking about independence as a possible outcome of the war. But they were peripheral at this time to these debates, although the Social Democrats had had negotiations with them. So, obviously there was some talk about it. There were many different views, and this is why I'm saying that the Social Democratic Party was not monolithic. And I must say, even the Bolsheviks weren't monolithic at this time. There was a party like Georgians who were prone to splits and divisions on all topics, and the idea of nationalism was one of the most painful for them to discuss. So no party in that sense was pro-independence publicly. The Social Democrats were not distinguished in that sense. Having said that, the Social Democrats, particularly the leaders like Noor Jordania, but not Kaki Chrenkeli, again the difference you can see between them. Noor Jordania was committed to the Marxist idea of a multinational Russian Federation in which Georgia would have, and they agreed to this late in 1917, would have national territorial autonomy. Before that, they were arguing for cultural autonomy and regional autonomy. So they moved quite clearly closer to that idea of national territorial autonomy. And then there was, in November, there was the first meeting of a large meeting of the National Council. Over 300 Georgians attended, priests, generals, merchants. The National Assembly, I meant, not the National Soviet, sorry. The National Soviet was elected by the National Assembly. So the National Assembly, in which Jordania came out with a dramatic speech in which he clearly was arguing that we have to start thinking now about nationalizing a Georgian state, about creating a Georgian state and nationalizing it. And he was getting a lot of applause during the speech from Socialist Federalists, National Democrats, and others. It was a distinct shift in his public rhetoric. Georgi Kvazava, a National Democrat, had talked about Georgian independence as being accidental, in the sense that I think it was, and it was true, as Richard said, for all of the republics, that this, although there was within the Georgian Social Democrats, I would argue there was a strong national push. The idea of political independence was still something sort of nebulous for them. It was accidental in the sense that it followed, as indeed it did in 1991, a collapse of empire. It wasn't as if this was a national movement clamoring for independence and achieving it. It wasn't. It was a result of war and imperial collapse. But when it came, I would argue, and I know probably the people in this audience who disagree with me, the Georgian Social Democrats took on the responsibility. There were many disagreements. Many people in the Georgian Social Democratic Party left, particularly non-Georgians, who were arguing, okay, this is it. This is no longer about socialism. We're leaving. And among them, many Armenians. The Georgian Social Democrats had abandoned the idea of a socialist revolution, which I think they had. And, the very symbolic indication of Jordania, I'm sorry I'm going on, I could talk about this for a long time. I'll stop after this. Maybe I can answer your other questions later, Sergei, but the sort of symbolic recognition, if you like, of this shift toward nation and state building was the dispute about the red flag and the Georgian flag. And Jordania quite quickly told Valiko Djukheli, who remained one of the most radical of the Social Democrats, he was a former Bolshevik, take down that red flag. You can keep it for the National Guard, But now we are a national state, so we are flying the Georgian flag. And there were many other indications for example, very quickly, the Soviets, the workers, the peasant Soviets that had created this revolution were essentially emasculated, not disbanded, they were still there to monitor. But Jordania very firmly told them, he says, you're no longer in power. Now it's the parliament. It's a national parliament that's in power now. That's going to be the legislative body, and they will elect an executive government. You can hang around, but don't expect to be able to exercise any real power anymore. And I would love to answer your other questions, but I took too much time, so Richard.
All right. I think you have to tell us each, speak it 1 minute each, and then answer, right? And then, no, I mean for myself I'm talking.
I enjoy listening.
Well, it's the same, I think. There was no party among the Armenians who was enthusiastic about independence at the time, not that they didn't want to have autonomy or federation, etc. The largest party of the Armenians was known as the Tash Naksuchun, which means the Federation, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, which was created right here in Tiflis in 1890, and which focused most of its attention on the Ottoman Empire and the emancipation of the oppressed Ottoman Armenian people. So most of its activity was directed across the border and not here. But after the first Russian Revolution, and that is 1905, it did direct also its attention to Russian Armenia. And here it came closely to what we're speaking about of federalism, a future Russian federal state with significant autonomy. And there was a time, even with the Mensheviks and others, they were talking about the creation of sort of zemstva regions, of local self-governing regions based on ethnic territorial foundations. So that there might be 5 or 6 Armenian districts within the Caucasus where they were a clear majority, Alexandropol and perhaps even in Karabakh, etc. But that never took off. That never took off. And so in 1918, when it was an impossible moment, Russia was gone and Turkey was present, still there was division. There were some members of the Armenian National Council of the dominant party who said it's better to be occupied and not declare independence. Keep the fiction that we're a part of the Russian Empire, and that the violation of our land and our people is a violation against Russia. And that way to have some degree of legitimate protection for ourselves in the future. But that, and also among those were the representative of the Armenian bourgeoisie. The name of their party was the equivalent of Cadet, a constitutional Democrat. They were known as the People's Party or the Populist Party. They were even more reluctant. And I think underneath some of this may have been also personal, that they didn't want to abandon Tiflis. They didn't want to leave here. This was their place. They had mansions, Sokolaki and wherever, Sololaki and places like that. So maybe that also affected their reluctance. I'm not sure. I wasn't in their minds. Any case, I'm sorry that there isn't an Azerbaijani scholar here tonight, because I'm getting a sense that maybe the Muslim leadership was not so unhappy, because there was a strong move of pan-Turkic, pan-Islamic sentiment among the intellectuals of the Muslims of the Caucasus. And the Turkish aggression for them was not aggression. Turkish aggression for them was a part of liberation. They were resentful of Russian rule. They felt that it favored the Christian population of the Caucasus, and so they might have a different take on this, is that the Turkish invasion of the Caucasus is our moment of fulfilling this dream ideal that some intellectuals came up with of either pan-Islamic or pan-Turkic kinds of objectives.
Thank you very much. We invited 6 different scholars from Azerbaijan to speak of Azerbaijani perspective, but unfortunately we got refusal from each of them, and someone has to talk on their behalf, and I'll try to take one question. So this question is to you, Professor Hovhannisyan. Armenia and Russia, and I should do some brief introduction to this question. So we know that in 1915 the Russians could not or did not prevent genocide. That we know that Russians during the World War I committed to give an autonomy, national autonomy to Armenians, to unite Western and Eastern Armenia, and to give national autonomy. But in private correspondence, Russian ministers and even Tsar told to each other that we are not going to give any autonomy to Armenia, and we are going to evict these people from their homes and to settle in Cossacks and other Russians. And then during the course of 1919, 1920, when Denikin was flirting with Armenians, and Armenians were asking him that, just do a declaration, just make a statement that you are going to recognize Armenia, but Denikin never did this statement. And then remembering letter of Armenian Foreign Minister Tigranian, he wrote that I don't know if there is going to be any benefit from pro-Russian policy, but looking back to the past, we were harmed and destroyed a lot because of pro-Russian policy. So was it not very much naive? And even looking at it today, so Armenia has...
the Armenians were used and exploited by Imperial Russia. As you probably know, after the 1905 revolution, there was the Stolypin repression, and of all the Caucasian intellectuals and political leaders here. World War I, 1914, and even before, there was a shift in Russian policy under Tsar Nicholas to try to win back the loyalty of the Caucasian peoples by giving them little things. And in the case of the Armenians, to pretend to be champions of the emancipation of the Turkish Armenian population, to encourage the Armenians to organize volunteer units in the Russian army during the beginning of World War I, whereas at the same time they are making plans for annexation of the Western Armenian provinces in the Turkish Empire without a place for autonomous Armenia. So that is true, and I think that the period during the Republic was a bit different, and maybe different today as well. They didn't trust Denikin. They didn't like the Bolsheviks at all. And if they wanted to insult anyone, they say you're doing this like a Bolshevik. I mean, and we're opposed to the centralization. But with Denikin, they had some practicality of trying to make some kind of agreement with him. First of all, there were many, many thousands of Armenian refugees in South Russia. And how do you protect these people? And how do you eventually bring them back? If the big powers are going to create a united Armenian state by giving you Van and other areas of eastern Turkey, you need to populate them, and you need also to safeguard these thousands of Armenians who are caught between the red and white armies and are sometimes persecuted by both. That was one issue. The second issue was military. So long as there were volunteer army units along the Caucasus range, and so long as they were along the borders of Azerbaijan and Georgia, both the Georgian and Azerbaijanis would have to deflect a part of their military power to those borders, which would then mean that there would be less, if in the case of any trouble with the Armenian state, that the white armies would draw off a part of the military of these powers and therefore decrease the pressure, particularly from Azerbaijan. I mean, there was, as you well know, a very regrettable short war between Armenia and Georgia at the end of 1918, but then they tried to mend relations, and there were, you know, the Armenians and Georgians have a certain love-hate relationship that goes on even to this day. But in general, they're okay. They're okay. But with Azerbaijan, it was not that way. You know, there's the struggle over Karabakh was going on, and so if you can get the Azeri army to take one of its divisions or two of its divisions onto the northern front, it decreased. So I think that it may have been a practical reason. As for today, Armenians, yeah, they don't trust Russia, but they need Russia. They don't trust them. They know they can be betrayed, but they can't trust the West even more, because the West has betrayed them even more greater than has Russia. They made agreement, Russia, Soviet, Lenin and Stalin made an agreement with Mustafa Kemal to allow him to take Kars, Ardahan area, back in 1920 in the secret negotiations that took place in Moscow in the summer and fall of 1920, and only after the Soviets had given the Turks the understanding that Russia would not interfere. Only then did Kemal feel comfortable enough to attack Armenia in the fall of 1920. And as you well know, the only bit of the provinces of Kars and Batum that were saved for the Caucasus was the port of Batum, the port of Batumi, and its immediate surrounding areas of Ajaria, whereas all the rest of Batum, Artvin, and all the rest of Batum province and all of Kars province were given to, allowed to go to Turkey. And so, you know, how can you trust the Russians again? And yet, what is your alternative? You know, they say a drowning man holds on to the snake or to the serpent. And I suppose in some ways it fits in the Armenian case.
My question will somehow follow up on what Sergei Kapanadze was asking, but more precisely, it concerns the Georgian-Armenian relations after independence was declared. So you perfectly outlined that probably the fates of both republics was somehow determined by the international system and the extreme poverty Stephen was referring to. So probably they were doomed for the failure. But if they were more cooperative, because as we see, both were building their independence on each other's expense, not in cooperation to each other. And if there was a cooperation, would it make them a bit more resilient? And if so, whether there were any influential forces in both Georgia and Armenia who were supporting the idea of better cooperation, understanding, and if there were such forces, that what made them fail? So who made mistakes in this respect, and what were these mistakes? Thank you.
We have to give these leaders some credit. Even though they had problems, they're better than they are today in that the Caucasian leaders, Georgians, Armenians, Azerbaijanis, exchanged diplomatic missions among the three countries. Today, Armenia and Azerbaijan have no diplomatic relations. They had frequent or occasional conferences of the Transcaucasian leadership who got together. And you know, one of the things that I feel about the Caucasians is that even though they had opposite interests for their states, they all were so much alike, these people. They had so much, I look at them and I can't tell who's a Georgian, who's an Armenian, who's an Azerbaijani. They're all dressed in these nice European style suits and speak beautiful language. You know, again, as much as you don't like Russian, it's the common language that they can, which links them together. And there was some, even though Armenians were resentful of the Georgians, because in fact they felt that they had been deprived of their main town. You know, Tbilisi was their town. They were resentful, and they were also resentful of the fact that Georgia controlled the railways to Yerevan. And at any given moment, if Georgia wanted to, it could say, we have railway repairs for 1 week and we can't have any traffic. And that is a way of putting, pressure on them. But having said that, there are also a number of very important agreements and understandings of railway conventions and other kinds of conventions that were signed among the republics. And I personally do not think that whether Armenians and Georgians were 100% friendly with each other or not, I do not think it was going to affect the final Sovietization of the Caucasus, which was going to come without some kind of external intervention, as happened after World War II, when you had the Truman program and the Marshall program and various other programs of giving strong kind of support. And without that support, whether it was an Armeno-Georgian combined loose alliance or a separate, even hostile Georgia and Armenia, I don't think that was. That's my opinion, and I may be certainly wrong. You can prove me wrong. In any case, it's a good lesson for our states today that cooperation and coordination is far very much to be desired.
So I think it's worth remembering that Georgian-Armenian relations were pretty good throughout much of the 18th, 19th century. When Georgians began to think about or gained more education and more Georgians came to the city and became more conscious of their national identity, we began to see then these ethnic divisions emerge, particularly over questions of control of Tbilisi, right? And Oliver Reisner has written about this in terms of the electoral struggles that went on between Armenians and Georgians. And then, of course, in 1905, we again saw these national divisions, in particular between Azerbaijanis and Armenians, where there was bloody conflict. I think in many cases what was happening was, first, there was this growth of democracy, this growth of sort of national ideas. It wasn't just happening in Georgia, it was happening in Europe more generally. And this aspiration for self-determination and self-government. I do think that, although Richard points out that there was exchange of diplomatic relations and so on, there was this attempt to create a federation, the Transcaucasian Federal Republic, which emerged as an independent state in April of 1918. But it was quite clear very early on in the international context. So if the war hadn't been going on, we might have seen a different situation. But in that context, it was very clear very soon that the Armenians, the Georgians, and Azerbaijanis had incompatible interests, and that each nation's national security conflicted with the other. in terms of relations certainly with Turkey. So the other part of it, of course, was that eventually the Georgians decided that the only way they could survive and retain some of their territory was to get the patronage of the Germans, who were, of course, the allies of the Ottomans, and they were present in Georgia. It was a German military mission, and secure their own survival. Now, that wasn't something that pleased the Armenians. They were completely abandoned as a result, and open to the ravages of the Ottoman army. So, relations didn't get off to a good start. And then the whole process of how you build a state. So one of the first things that the Georgian government does is it declares that Georgian language is the state language. And that comes actually in October of 1918. And, you can imagine the ramifications and complications of that in a multinational society like Georgia. It meant effectively exclusion or disadvantage for those who didn't speak Georgian. In some sense you understand it because the Georgian state wanted to be Georgian, like every other state, in Europe. This was part of what was going on elsewhere too. But it obviously had serious ramifications in the ethnographic context of Georgia at that time. The other thing, of course, that was disastrous in terms of Georgian-Armenian relations was, as Richard mentioned, the war of December 1918. And this then became an excuse, and it's one of the less pleasant pages, I guess, of Georgian social democracy or the Georgian state. It did become a reason or an excuse then to discriminate and purge Armenians who were long-standing members of the community. They were expelled from their homes. In many cases, they were forced to leave Tbilisi. It was a sort of pogrom in a way. This distrust between Armenians and Georgians after that never disappeared, despite the fact that, they could look back to over 200, maybe and more years of cooperation as neighbors. But I think, in some sense, it was the international situation which simply tore them apart. And, they each pursued their own path of survival.
Thank you, Georgi.
Thank you, and thank you for this very enlightening interventions. I know we're touching upon enormous subjects, but nevertheless, I think this audience is very much looking forward to being enlightened on some of these important subjects. And I have quick questions on these subjects. To continue the previous question, do you think that some of these diplomatic efforts of somehow bringing the three republics together on the world stage, for example, in the stage of the Paris Peace Conference, after the completion of the First World War, could have eventually succeeded? Having read some of the minutes of the debates of our Constituent Assembly, I would encounter episodes when ministers would report on some of these peace conferences upon Georgian initiative. Was this wishful thinking, or something could have come out of it eventually? I know it's a big subject, but you can be as quick as possible. But also, I cannot avoid asking about the role of Stalin. Because obviously in January 1921, Georgia did achieve the full-fledged international recognition, unlike many other countries that were created on the ruins of the Russian Empire. And I've also encountered some of the minutes of the discussion about Georgia in the Bolshevik Politburo, in which Lenin was sort of leaning towards postponement of the issue, and Stalin was. So would it be fair to argue that without Stalin's insistence, Georgia could have endured a little bit more? Without Stalin insisting on launching of the invasion of Georgia as soon as possible, could Georgia survive basically for some more time?
Diplomatic efforts, right? Paris Peace Conference. Well, I do think that one of the problems was this lack of solidarity among Caucasian states, although I sort of understand the reasons why there were these divisions and why there was this resentment among the different nationalities. For example, the Armenians were deathly afraid that, you know, the Georgians and the Azerbaijanis were going to get together and outvote them in every single case. If there was a confederation of the three republics, the Armenians in some sense would be in a permanent minority. That wasn't a good position for them to be in. So they were very reluctant. And also, and Richard talks a lot about this in his book, they were always looking to the West, although they had been betrayed by the West, but they were looking to the West, you know, to President Wilson and other promises that had been made by the Supreme Allied Council that, you know, Armenia would get its just desserts, it would get autonomy in Turkey and so on. So they were hanging on to, I guess, a greater aspiration. And, you know, at the peace conference, the Armenians had two delegations. I mean, it wasn't as if the Armenians were particularly united either on what they wanted and how they were going to negotiate it. At the peace conference, and Rebecca knows much more about this than I do, there was cooperation, but in terms of presenting memorandums and making the case, but they were told constantly by the Allies, get together, come as a united sort of federation of sorts, or at least show us some degree of cooperation, and you're more likely to get support from Western states if that's the case, if they can see some cooperation and stability, which was not apparent. Obviously, December 1918, Georgia and Armenia go to war, which the British have to step in and stop from escalating. There's war, of course, over Nagorno-Karabakh. There's war, or scuffles, or whatever you want to call it, with Zaqatali and Georgia. So, you know, from the West point of view, you know, it wasn't it was a potential for what the American military would call a swamp, right? They didn't want to get involved in this swamp unless they wanted the Georgians, Armenians, and Azerbaijanis to find their own way and find some form of cooperation. The other thing about Stalin, you know, is absolutely, you're right about, you know, Stalin's resentments against Georgians because he was isolated. He was an outsider in Georgia from 1906, 1907 as a Bolshevik, and completely humiliated in many occasions, and particularly by Noor Jordania on an occasion, and resented his sort of noble demeanor and ways. You know, Stalin saw himself much more as a man of the people. But it wasn't just Stalin, who was with the 11th Army down in the Caucasus, you know. Azerbaijan fell in April, Armenia fell in November, you know. Orjonikidze was just biting the bit to get into Georgia. And it was a very easy thing to do, because the Georgians themselves had not managed to create cooperation at home between the different national groups. And that goes back to Sergei's question, you know. They were in enmity with Armenians, with South Ossetians and Abkhazians. I think that could have been managed much better. It was always very difficult to do it, but there were opportunities, and the Georgian government failed. And that really opened up things. Opened up things to intervention by Russia. The other thing was the Western countries themselves. They gave clear signals. They were no longer interested. Stalin, of course, picked up on those signals. So they said they wanted the British who were there, they didn't have a mandate, but they were responsible for that area, said, we have to leave, we want to leave. I mean, there were debates going on in the British cabinet. Some people were saying, no, we had to stay. But it was given up as a case that, you know, we couldn't defend Georgia. They left Batumi, their last point. So, they abandoned Georgia essentially. Jordania said at one stage, when he was in negotiations with the British, we have not received bread or a single rifle from you, you know. And they didn't. And then after they left in July, in July 1920, 7th of July, Lloyd George began negotiations with the Soviet Union for an Anglo-Soviet trade agreement. So if you think the NATO decision in Bucharest was a signal to the Soviet Union in April, right, 2008, yeah, to Russia that we're not really going to do much here. The signals were pretty clear that the West was no longer interested in defending the Caucasus and Georgia. And, you know, if you were Stalin or Orджоникидзе, clearly, you know, well, they're not going to come back in the country and defend this country. It's open to us.
I won't add anything. I think
you didn't. Please.
Well, just very briefly, the interests of the three states were really quite different at that stage. At the Paris Peace Conference, Armenia felt it had an advantage over both Georgia and Azerbaijan because of international sympathy that had been gained during World War I and the massacres and deportations of the Armenians. There was far more recognition of Armenia than there was of Georgia and Azerbaijan. So they wanted to take advantage of that, and I think they were afraid that if they came forward as a Caucasian unity, that perhaps they would be jeopardizing their hopes for the unification of Western Armenia. I cannot say that and all, but we do know that the three delegations did negotiate, and very intensely and sometimes very negatively, over access to Batumi port, for example, for Armenia, a landlocked country. That was a major issue for this landlock, and it was never really resolved. The other thing is, you know, we talk about de jure recognition of Georgia or de facto recognition of Georgia. We all know that came only after, in a sense of desperation by the West, because in the first instance, because of the victory of or the defeat of the White armies and the advance of the Red armies to the borders of the Caucasus. And so when the Red armies got to the borders of the Caucasus, they decided in January 1920 to recognize the Caucasian states. And then 1921, after the Sovietization of both Armenia and Georgia, well, then, you know, yeah, let's recognize de jure Georgia now. But why did we wait so long? It was a matter of ex post, whatever it was, and had no thing. One final little thing. At the time of the Sovietization of Georgia or occupation of Tbilisi in March 1921, this was a time when the Armenians were in rebellion against the Soviets. There was a February uprising against the first taste of Soviet rule. So Armenia, Yerevan and its surroundings, the Red Army had been expelled, the Revcom had been expelled, not from the whole country. And that might have, I'm not sure that might or might not have something to do with the decision to, I mean, let's now take care of Georgia and then turn back and suppress these people here. I don't have the internal sources, but it's a speculation.
Thank you very much. And one question I shouldn't necessarily ask, and I cannot resist. So, Moscow Agreement of March 1921 between New Turkey and Soviet Russia, and then Kars Agreement of October 1921. I have never heard or never read anywhere comparison of these agreements with Molotov-Ribbentrop Treaty. Over Molotov-Ribbentrop Treaty. But it seems to me quite similar from the point of view of dividing the region, division of region by two imperial powers. but Georgians cannot coin this name for these agreements because now currently Georgia has quite good strategic relationship with Turkey, and neither can Armenians do the same because Armenia is in a good terms with Russia. But as a historians, can we say that there are similarities and how similar these agreements are?
I think you have to answer that question. You probably know better. Do you have another? There might be. I think this was a moment of weakness on a part of Soviet Russia. I think that they believed that Turkey had the key to the Islamic world, and that if they could appease Turkey and give Mustafa Kemal what he wanted, they could turn the Islamic world against the imperialist powers. So I think that Stalin at that moment was working not from any sense of security, but a sense of weakness. And he may have regretted it because in 1946, as you know, he again wanted to claim those very territories that he was willing to give up. And it was ironic, you know, we talk about the Moscow negotiations. Isn't it funny that they're negotiating the fate of the Caucasus, and yet the Armenian Soviet foreign commissar, whose name was Beksadyan, is not even allowed to sit in the negotiations. He cannot even represent his Soviet Armenian state, and Stalin allows that to happen. So, you know, I can't go beyond that. But, you know, this young man here and this lady over here has had the hands up forever.
So I'll keep mine very quick because I think there are more questions than we... I think it was just a question at this time of common interests. And I think, as Richard said, in some sense, you know, both the Soviet Union and Kemal, Mustafa Kemal, were they were sort of facing Western antagonism, and you know, it was a sort of natural partnership for them in some sense. So common interests. Part of it, of course, was even though this agreement went ahead, there was this Turkish caveat that Ajara should be given some degree of autonomy as recognized as a Muslim unit. But yeah, I mean, it was, and I think Richard's point too, that this was perhaps one of the first gestures of, you know, the undeveloped world, as it were, against the Western world. They had common interests, and they could cooperate with each other. And then, of course, the Soviet Union went on to cooperate with Germany in the 1920s, again as a common pariah state, if you like. You know, seeking allies clearly was very important for the Soviet Union at that time because it felt extremely vulnerable.
I was wondering about selective memories that our societies have about the time of the independent republics and even before the independent republics. We somehow, at least Georgians and Azerbaijanis, I know, I've lived in Baku for 5 years, and they clearly have very selective memories of the time. And Georgians seem to also to have some selective memories. And I was just wondering, how would you, as historians with wider perspective of the region and world, how would you explain that? The selective memory of the societies here.
Of course, this is a very interesting new way of thinking about the past, right? And you know, we could go back to Ernest Renan, who wrote a piece called Qu'est-ce que c'est la nation, in which he said, you know, very much part of the nation is about forgetting as well as remembering. In other words, you know, there's so much bad things go on in the nation before it's united that you want to forget those bad things, but otherwise, you know, the nation won't come together. You know, in the Georgian case, you know, what we had after the First Republic and the reason that we forgot it, I think there are a number of factors that go into this. Firstly, you had the victor dictating history, namely the Soviet Union. So it could hide everything else it didn't want. And it could do it too, most certainly because it was a totalitarian state. So it's not like the British trying to hide history, because there were always historians who would challenge them. In the Soviet Union, that was not the case. Despite the fact that the Europeans had been extraordinarily interested in the Georgian experiment between 1918 and 21, I call it an experiment. It really wasn't an experiment as such as an ambitious plan. In the 30s, the 20s and the 30s, of course, the great hopes for socialism disappeared. None of the revolutions occurred. You got the rise of fascism. You weren't going to start thinking about, the social democracy at that time, exploring it. After the Second World War, things looked up, and historians had the possibility. But just think about it. Trying to do some work on the First Republic that was within the Soviet Union in the strangest language. Nobody was, I guess that I and a few others in England, we were the first who were taking that step in the 1970s. Up until then, there was no real historical exploration. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, when independence came, there was this consensus that Georgian social democracy represented an anti-national idea in some sense, that they had not really been truly patriotic. People weren't afraid to write about that period, but they were certainly not attracted to that period. We lost, I guess, 30 years of potential exploration. I think in some cases, there were some instances of Soviet scholars trying to break through that wall. There was, for example, a very good friend of mine I met very early on, Ushang Sidemonidze, and when he tried it, he was removed from his job and punished. I think it's really, it's not surprising in some sense that it was foreigners who, maybe first took the initiative to look at this history and to try and remember it. But now I think Georgians are taking over, and it's wonderful to watch.
I think Stephen spoke enough about selective memory. Selective memory is in all of us. We all have selective memory, and particularly if you're a victim, you have even more selective memory. You remember your victimhood and so forth. You don't remember those people whom you've harmed. You remember those who have harmed you. That seems to be a rather human thing, and also on a national basis. But on the other hand, there are those who remind us, and I think the role of the historian and humanitarian and sociologist is to remind us that there are other perspectives here. I've tried to do that in my work. I'm not objective. I cannot be objective fully, because I'm a human. And even when I say that I'm objective, if I have an Armenian-Azerbaijani issue, just the way in which I present the facts, first what the Azerbaijanis say, and then what the Armenians say. The fact that I'm saying first what the Azerbaijanis say, and secondly what the Armenians say, it seems like I'm giving greater strength to the second. I'm trying to be honest, and I'm trying to be balanced, but there is no absolute balance. But still, I do not say that Azerbaijanis do not have a case for Karabakh. They have a case. And we have to know what it is. And I don't say that, whatever it may be. So we need to have our collective memory stimulated, as in the case of in the United States, the treatment of native populations, the issue of slavery. These all had their very, very convenient selective memories by mainstream politicians and historians for a very long time. And so it was up to a younger generation of scholars, and I'm pleased now. I think that both in what I've seen in Armenia recently and what I'm now feeling here in Georgia is that there is a young generation of scholars that is questioning, and in Turkey too, even with all the repressive situation in Turkey, you have a brave generation of young scholars who are crossing ethnic lines and who are looking for the truth and trying to tell their governments to remember more than they want us to remember.
I just want to ask one question. It was very interesting that sometimes I was excited, and sometimes I had the feeling that I was the testimony of a burial. So, testimony of a burial. So, I want just to ask you that when Noé Jordania once was talking with his wife, Ina Ivanovna asked him, "But Noé, we did all that. We were struggling, suffering, and what for?" And Noé answered, "Athens was a small city, and it nearly was destroyed, but this city illuminated the world, enlightened the world with one idea, democracy." Can you tell us what we can say about each country's independence to can illuminate something for us, to have a feeling of a way?
I can only say that in the Caucasian republics, there was sufficient commitment to the concept of democratic institutions that they created the shell of democracy. Not democracy, but the institutions of democracy. Parliamentary government, cabinet system of government. They were not perfect, they were not properly developed. There wasn't enough time. I mean, in Armenia, Armenians had never had a national election. Now suddenly they're going to have a parliamentary election. We know that today how difficult it is and how corrupt elections are even today, and yet they went through the motions as they did here in Georgia. They were not perfect. Undoubtedly there was ballot stuffing, undoubtedly they had fraud and so, but they had created the institutions of where they wanted to go. The fact that they gave the vote to women, at least in Armenia, I'm not sure about Georgia, in Georgia as well, at a time when the United States was just thinking about it, and France had to wait 20 years more to think about it, shows that these people were committed to these egalitarian socialistic concepts, which did not have enough time to develop into a normal situation. I mean, try to create a national, to have a national election where people have never had an election, where most of them maybe can't even read and write, but they can put their X next to a number, and that's what they did. So I admire that generation. I admire it far more. I mean, in the Armenian case, I admire that generation with all its shortcomings much more than I do the post-Soviet generation, which found ways simply to enrich itself and to self-replicate itself. I mean, those people that I deal with in 1918, 1919 came and sacrificed their lives. They died with the population in disease, and they didn't fill their pockets. And now we see the nouveau riche from Soviet times who have these mansions here and there and have no shame. And so I have this, they gave us an ideal, and the fact that we may have had unsuccessful or successful colored revolutions, whether it be Georgia or now in Armenia, I think it comes from, that can be the heritage that you're speaking about.
So I would like to second what Richard says, and I'm glad we're ending on a moral note in some sense, because that's what politics really, in a way, is about. And I think that this is what distinguished the Georgian Social Democrats, is they believed in the primacy of politics, whereas Marxists tended to believe in the primacy of economics, this sort of neutral bulldozer that was going to go forward, whatever. Whereas the Social Democrats really had some political ideas about how they actually had to govern in the best possible way. And they didn't totally succeed. I would be a little more optimistic than Richard. I wouldn't call the Georgian institutions in the First Republic shells. I do think that they were actually working in some cases quite well. The Constituent Assembly, for example. I mean, if you look at the debates on the floor and in the commissions, they were real debates. Now, the other side of that, the problem was, and it's a problem today, is that in Georgia there is this tendency for a single party that dominates the political system. And there are great temptations that go with that. So in the First Republic, the Social Democrats swept the elections they had. And some of the oppositions were just saying, when you look at the parliament or constituent assembly, what we see is a state within a state. The Georgians basically, the Social Democrats basically determine all legislation. Now, maybe that's not unusual in parliamentary systems when a majority exists. They do what they want. But it reflects very poorly in many ways on the nature of the political system. And I think that's a legacy that's come through today. So, when we think about, I'm not sure it just comes from the Communist Party, but, when you think about Gamsakhudia and his party, basically excluding the opposition, and then you had Shevardnadze, a party, what was it called now? Civil Union, right? What was it called? Citizens Union. I forget already. And then, of course, National Movement, and now we have Georgian Dream. This is when democracy cannot work effectively when you have such a weak and excluded, largely marginalized opposition. The other thing is, the other legacy, I think, was what Richard was touching on, is that we still have, and it was to some extent modified in the First Republic, because the Georgian Social Democrats were trying to promote a degree of support for ordinary people in Georgia, right? So Noy Jordania comes out with a very interesting proposal. It's called Social Democracy and the Organization of the Georgian State, in which he argues the only way to overcome the chasm between the government and the people, between the executive and the people, is to create a system in which the people actually participate. Political scientists today call this strong democracy or deliberative democracy, where people actually get to participate. And there was an attempt to do that. Didn't always come about. In Georgia today, unfortunately, I think we've gone back in the sense that that chasm between a government and an executive, and people who feel that they don't have any right, well, they have rights, but they don't have any power. And, that's a sort of legacy of this sort of single party dominance. I'm hoping that I think it was Disraeli said, no government is going to work properly unless there's an opposition. It can't work on its own. And that's something that, I think has to be addressed and thought about.
A final comment? Final comment. I'm really thankful to a very patient audience that's been sitting here for more than 2 hours listening to the two of us ramble on. Again, I think it's significant that we're here. I want to thank Becca for organizing this evening because it comes back to the commonalities of experiences of we of the South Caucasus, whether we live in the South Caucasus or in Los Angeles or wherever it might be, and we have common interests that hopefully we can find a greater rapport and means to solve our issues in a peaceful and productive manner. But in any case, it was a restoration of Armenian statehood after more than a half millennium of nothing, of being foreign subjects. And for Georgia, as you well know, well over a century, and even then, Georgia was not a united state as such when each of these principalities and kingdoms was annexed, and it reemerged as something else. You know, it was like the cocoon, the caterpillar, that then went into the cocoon and was born as a butterfly. So I'd like to congratulate the butterfly. All right?
I hate to go on beyond that because I think that's a wonderful place to stop about the butterfly. But, you know, one of the things I think about the First Republic, you know, working in the archives, you see all the intrigue and, you know, the background to the choices that they make. And they made many mistakes, but then you compare it with the achievements of over 3 years, and it's really quite incredible what they managed to do in the conditions that they were in. And I would say the same about Georgia today. You know, when you think of the last 25 years and the horrors of the 1990s and the struggle to create some sort of economic stability, and the vast sort of polarization that went on in political life, that the Georgians have overcome that. I mean, there are still problems, definitely. But, you know, in a sense, Georgia is so much better where it is now. And it's an amazing achievement given that, again, in 1991, it was a country that was starting from scratch, you know, didn't have a foreign ministry. Well, it had a foreign ministry with three or four civil servants. You know, it didn't have the experience of a real parliament or legal institutions that were independent. Now, I know there are people sitting in this audience today who would say, you know, we've still got a long way to go. Yeah, absolutely. But in terms of achievements, I think, you know, if you look at it in perspective, it's incredible how far Georgia has come. So congratulations.